I was in an unfamiliar place, my surroundings dark, haunting, and bizarre. I would say I found myself there upon waking up, but I didn't awaken as much as I just became aware. I didn't feel groggy or fatigued in any way. I was just simply there. I had no memory of anything that had come before as I turned my head from side to side, my eyes meeting what appeared to be an ancient amusement park. Dried out moss and dead leaves covered the structures and cracked concrete beneath my feet. Foggy and broken glass upon tarnished and crumbling walls of small buildings and shacks, along with the rusted beams and bolts barely holding what were once rides together. I looked down at my body, finding the drab, dark gray jumpsuit as unfamiliar as everything else around me. My foreign fingers contouring the stubbled flesh of my face, running through my thick, somewhat wavy hair. I pulled strands to my field of vision, making out a muted, dusty brown, but I didn't recognize it. Wherever I was, every color was as muted and dull as those of my own hair and garments. My boots looked black, but layered in dust, as though they had been hidden away in this ancient and forgotten place before I slipped them upon my feet. Though the windows were caked in what I was inclined to call the sands of time, I managed to clear away a spot on one of the broken down old shops just across from where I stood. I couldn't make out much of my reflection, but I did not know the man who stood before me looking back. He looked to be around his late 20s or early 30s, if I had to guess. His eyes appeared a good decade older than the rest of his face, along with the sprinklings of gray throughout his thick and unkempt beard stubble. He wore a dark and also somewhat dusty jumpsuit with a name tag on the left pocket of his chest. Richard, the sewn-on patch read. Great, I thought aloud with a sigh. I'm a dick. I stared at this unrecognizable image upon the foggy glass for some time, neither locating the memory of the man glaring back at me, nor feeling compelled to get moving. Though it appeared that I was alone in this desolate and somewhat melancholy place, I had no idea as to what I should be attempting to find, should I choose to look around. Granted, standing in place attempting to find anything familiar about the man staring bewildered into my eyes wasn't as much as causing the locked-up gears in my head to start spinning again, but with my surroundings being as foreign as my own reflection, I legitimately could not narrow down my next steps. Ultimately, cutting my gaze from my own eyes, feeling both annoyed by the lack of any useful information cracking through my skull, I understood that I was accomplishing nothing by remaining in place. With that realization, I shoved my hands into my pockets and began to wander away from the broken-down old storefront. Though I was far more than unsettled by my circumstances, I couldn't deny that there was a strange sort of haunting beauty to my surroundings. The seemingly ancient roller coasters, carousels, and dried-up water slides looked as though mine were the only eyes to perceive them in centuries, something that left me in awe in a bizarre sort of way. Regardless of the silence around me, the clumping footsteps of my heavy work boots caused barely an echo, only a muffled, hollow clapping against the split concrete. Though I was nervous about my uncertain stroll through this museum of forgotten things, I found it strange that I didn't feel more afraid. Yes, my thoughts were in a sort of relaxed chaos, but my pulse was soft, and my body was not even tensed up. I was aware of my heartbeat, that regular thumping against my eardrums and lazy throbbing in my chest, but it didn't seem hastened in any way. Just there. Even when the first sounds beyond my busy mind, digging for any fragment of a memory, met my ears, I felt somewhat excited, but not as apprehensive as I probably should have been under the circumstances. I continued to casually saunter in the direction of that muffled, shuffling noise, but I didn't feel compelled to rush toward it. As I paced toward a corner, the broken down and faded sign above what appeared to have once been a waiting area, I felt my feet hesitating, regardless of my mind's desire to continue on. The name assigned to the right, to which this now vacant line led, struck a familiar chord with me I couldn't quite reach. The only letters remaining, basically the left side of the sign, which was only slightly less deformed than the rest, read P-H-A-P-R-E. Fapre? I thought aloud, the gears slowly gripping onto the vague memory. Phantom Predator? This was one of the more popular rides amongst these other relics. How could I know that? This place looked practically untouched by anything other than time for, years? Decades? Centuries? Sure, I ended up here, somehow or another, but how would I know anything about a place long since dead? As I gazed, perplexed by the recollections attempting to form in my otherwise blank slate of a mind, somewhere in the distance of my thoughts, that shuffling sound had grown considerably louder. It was still muted, just like everything else in this damned place, but I knew that whatever was causing that unsettling noise was emitting from only feet or yards away at most. Glancing back up to the oddly bewildering sign and to the path veering to the right, I felt my pulse begin to grow more erratic than it had since I came back to awareness. My footsteps both hesitant and as stealthy as I could make them, I let out a shuddering breath as I approached what may lie ahead. They came into view the instant I rounded that corner, some 80 to 100 feet away, if I were to wager a guess. Each of the ripped, torn, and shredded bodies stood in a row, looking barely aware of the grotesque wounds inflicted upon their seemingly lifeless frames. Though I didn't take the time to count, as I almost immediately nestled myself in the dried-out bushes alongside the wide path. After the initial shock subsided, anyway. I would say there were a good 30 of them, at least. Every one of them looked like a gory puzzle, pieced back together in one semi-solid structure. Limbs, looking as though they had once been peeled away, hung from the pale and blood-soaked figures, with bare bone and muscle exposed. What appeared to be chunks missing, as though something massive chewed into their flesh, revealed more of the meaty tissue of what once made these poor souls tick. Faces with jagged ditches, barely sealed back shut, shards of the jawbone and skull piercing through from inside, snapped ribs jutting from the chests and sides, and even shards of ragged spine dangling from behind. Intestines and disembodied organs dragged the ground as these pitiful creatures gradually moved their broken bodies forward. My own guts were churning from the sight of these grotesque remnants, my mind reeling from the implication of what this vision meant for me. My hands were patting down my own body in search of mortal wounds, while my welling eyes could not break from the sights before them. I could barely convince myself of what this all meant. Things became a good deal more clear when my gaze drifted toward the front of the assembly of those ripped from the world in a most brutal fashion. When I noticed the haunting figure guiding these poor creatures to, I assume, somewhere far beyond my understanding, I almost gasped aloud. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a dark, smoky imitation of a living thing, with tendrils of wispy fog catching the non-existent wind. As it shifted itself, outstretching a slender, almost glossy black limb from its misty form, I could see that the translucent gray smog surrounding it almost seemed to be its clothing. As it turned its attention to the path ahead, to where a subtle yet vibrant glow illuminated from a ways before it, I made out more of the slim stature through the ever-shifting cloud-like robe. Whose body was humanoid in its proportions, and seemed little more than a skeleton, layered in that slick tar-like flesh. The wispy dark fog encasing it covering its face like a hood pulled low, with almost vine-like tentacles of that smoke branching from its back. As it lifted its arm again, waving it in a gesture I would assume to instruct the others to follow, the misty sleeve appeared to split for a moment before wrapping itself back around the hauntingly thin limb. It was like the arm moved faster than the smoke, causing it to have to catch up, like some insane sort of sentient fog. As a whole, while that thing moved toward the light, with those broken husks in tow, the robe continued its course of drifting slightly behind each movement. It was almost mesmerizing to look at, but not enough to distract me from the fear of the truth of my predicament. I just stayed in place, controlling my almost spasming body to the best of my ability, terrified I would draw the attention of those I gazed upon, should my trembling rustle the dead leaves anymore. Sure, even the hollow footsteps of the group formed not even the slightest of echoes, just a constant pulsing sound, like a slowed-down version of my now rapid heartbeat, but I wasn't about to take any chances. Though I couldn't make out what it was that provided that glow from where they were headed, I saw a series of flickering flashes as each body vanished from my view. The way the light rippled, it made me think of pebbles being tossed into a still lake, leaving me to assume that's very similar to what was happening here. That they were passing through the surface of whatever this reality was, to whatever lies beneath. Once the last figure disappeared, with one final flash of that eerie glimmer, the illumination faded, returning the path ahead to that same muted blur as the rest of this bizarre place. This vague echo of a genuine, intangible reality from which I feared I may be led soon, inspired a terror which grew all the more apparent as I reluctantly separated myself from my hiding spot. It stood only a handful of steps from me, its eyes cutting through the wispy smoke of its lowered hood in a shimmering orange glow, far more vibrant than anything else I had witnessed since coming back to awareness. The skeletal structure of its eerie, slender frame was all the more haunting from as close as we now stood. It outstretched its bony hand, gesturing in a come-hither motion, the almost jerky motion of its fingers an unsettling contrast to the wispy tendrils entwining with its limbs and torso. I could feel it drawing me closer, as though part of me wished for nothing more than to experience its clammy and cold embrace. But only part of me. The rest of me, the fragments of my mind and body of which I still had full control, begged for any semblance of release from what that thing had in store for me. There was no inner debate, the horrified thoughts of what was coming kicking my weakening legs into action before that entranced and near hypnotized portion could offer anything in response. I had no way of knowing if it would be possible for me to escape the clutches of this abomination of sentient black clouds and charred bone, but I wasn't about to resign myself to whatever fate it decided without trying everything I could to return to the life I left behind, if that's even what was going on in this fucked up fever dream of a reality. As I ran in the direction away from that creature, that part of me it had already seduced practically pleaded for me to stop. I heard words I could not fully understand echoing into my eardrums, battling against my thundering pulse for dominance, but I wouldn't stop. I wouldn't slow or chance a single glance to my rear. I had to remember. I had to find a way of learning who I was before I was here, or how I even ended up here in the first place. The memories were there. I could feel them nibbling away on my subconscious, as though they began to subtly spark to life when I gazed upon that faded sign. I knew that place. I knew this place, or the reflection of what it once was, before being hidden by this melancholy, fabricated version of the world. If I couldn't find my way back, a very likely scenario at this point, I had to at least know why. Why I was sent here begging for release. Why I was able to resist the allure of that haunting figure while so many other broken husks followed it willingly and seemingly without question. Whether my belief that I could escape was blind hope, or that I was still tethered to the real world, I hoped to still exist behind this place. Every rusted, beaten down, and overgrown ride and attraction I drifted by began to inspire another flicker of recognition from my scattered thoughts. Somewhere in the background of my frenzied brain, I heard echoes of laughter and joyous screams. There were overheard discussions of the groups gathered together, awaiting their turn to board. They were there, whispering from the back room of my mind, the door to the things I had forgotten steadily creaking open, but not enough to make out a word of those being spoken. From what I could make out, none of this was directed at me, only events I had possibly witnessed. It's as though I was more of an observer than a participant. I was beginning to form recollections, yes, but I felt not the slightest connection to any of them. I had been running for longer than I can even say, the heaving of my lungs feeling more like something I was supposed to do rather than inspired to by my body weakening. Stopping in place, finally risking a glance behind me, my heavy breathing settled, with no lingering effects of my hastened sprint. My pulse was still racing, but relaxing all the more when I looked upon only more abandoned and foreign attractions from where I had fled. No smoke, no skeletal figures, and no eerie light illuminating from before or behind me. Once more, it would seem that I was alone, something both relieving and hopeless in its own right. The building I propped against, allowing my thoughts to categorize themselves a bit, was one to which I gave no concern. At that moment, it was simply a wall to lean on, resting legs that strangely did not feel the need to relax, with muscles enduring no particular strain. What now transfixed my gaze, however, was possibly the most familiar and most perplexing sight I had witnessed yet. At face value, it looked to be the ticket booth, alongside the restrooms and gate to where I knew a parking lot should be. Though I knew I had lingered on this very site before, I could barely fathom what lay beyond the reach of this desolate and depressing park. The word void comes to mind, to represent what dwelled beyond the reach of the far less tarnished sign reading Arcadian Heights Amusement Park, but that would lend credence to the idea that nothing was there. What now inspired my jaw to fall limp was more of what I would almost compare to a nebula or cosmic storm. From my viewpoint, it seemed the world just fell short, right at the border between the gate and the vibrant, swirling vortex of the near-endless universe beyond my reach. Like were I to cross the gate, I would simply float away, gripped by the absence of gravity, pulling me into the spiraling, violet, crimson, and turquoise hues of nothing tangible or solid in any way. It was both mesmerizing and absolutely terrifying. The idea that nothing, no life or structures beyond these attractions of long since abandoned frivolity and joy were present in the universe anymore. That when I should leave this place, whether returning to the world above or descending to whatever may dwell below, even this park would cease to be, blending with the cosmos of absent stars and glorious colors. I paced closer to the gate, my head feeling almost one with the vibrant clouds before me, not stopping until my body bumped against the closed gates. My fingers wrapping around the bars, still hypnotized by the wonders upon which I glared. The fear once more began to rule over the wonder of it all. I spun around, my lungs suddenly struggling more than they had yet, even during my horrified sprint for my life, a condition that was all the more exaggerated when my eyes met the building upon which I had been leaning only moments before. The wall itself was nothing special or outstanding from any other I had fled past. The muted color scheme was just as bland and lifeless as everything else within the boundaries of this park, though my mind's eye could so clearly see the far more lively tones of this structure as they should be. In life, I knew those walls to be a light, almost sky blue, similar to those of the now drab and near milky tones of the ticket booth. As I reached for the keychain looped to my belt, the keys not as much as jingling from my touch, only lightly clinking together, I recalled walking through the door on the far right of the wall countless times over the previous years. I had no need to examine the keychain as I unclasped it from my belt, my feet guiding me closer to the familiar door. Without a glance, my muscle memory selected the one required to gain access to the building that was now close enough to touch. With a light click, I gently turned the knob, slipping the key loose and returning the clasp to my hip. There was no light inside, the pitch darkness surrounding me as I strolled in with no hesitation. I needed no illumination to find my way around, not to reach where I was headed anyway. I absent-mindedly strolled down the hallway, the distant scents of bleach and disinfectant breathing their familiar odor into my nostrils. There was no reason for me to open any of the doors drifting by on either side of me. The building wasn't large by any means, but I didn't need to investigate. I only sought the rear exit, through which my fellow employees and I would go to smoke on her breaks. Pushing open the door, the rusted hinges squealing ever so slightly, I looked upon the familiar railing of the small landing before me and the lengthy, descending staircase to my left. I just walked through, gripping the railing as the memories flooded the forefront of my mind, the scent of lingering nicotine in the air inspiring me to slip my pack from my right pocket. Again, my muscle memory ignited the tip of my cigarette, while my eyes continued to glare blankly across the shadows of the rides and attractions in the distance. Though the sensation was far duller than how I knew it to feel, that first inhale brought a not unwelcome euphoria to my still spinning senses. I could feel my pulse slowing with every beat, gradually regulating to whatever may be normal for this side of reality. Not yet prepared to look to my left, I just turned around, leaning my back against the railing, my eyes unfocused as I repeated the process of lifting my cigarette to my waiting lips. Once my smoke was spent, the butt tossed to the concrete landing and smeared with the tip of my boot, I took one more deep inhale before turning my head to the side. My feet in the air, they were the first thing I saw. The recollection of my body tumbling, almost sending me back on a similar stride. My head jerked to the side as I felt the impact again, the one I had only experienced for the briefest of moments before my eyes blinked back to awareness. Here. I couldn't fully recall what sent me tumbling down the steps, but I know I wasn't exactly in a fun-loving mood. Yeah. I had been in a funk for a few weeks now, ever since Ashley broke things off with me. And we had been fighting for a while by this point. I knew it was coming, but it still knocked the wind out of me. 3 years flushed away in a 5-minute phone conversation. She was right, of course, about the things she said, that I was going nowhere in life, and I was just dragging her down with me. I'm coming up on 30, having spent the last 7 years or so wasting away in this pitiful excuse for a job. I told her I'd become someone in the beginning, but that never happened. I drank my nights away, often slipping quite a few belts from my flask on the job as well. I was depressed while we were together, and even worse when we parted ways. Even in her arms, I knew I wasn't worth a shit. Sure, that part about taking some time to work on herself and be alone for a while was complete bullshit. Yeah, she hooked up with Dylan Cole not even a week after we split. I can't blame her, though. She deserves better than what I could offer. She deserves better than me. I had knocked back even more booze than normal that day, my work buddy Carl recommending that I step outside for a few before I drew any unwarranted attention. My legs betrayed me, my feet searching as I paced around, trying to clear my head, caught off guard by the ground seemingly having disappeared. I felt my body beating against the steps and the railing alongside it, with no scream escaping my lips or fear of what was happening attacking my thoughts. The second I felt my skull impact the landing below, that was when I first gazed upon this version of the park I had attended 5 to 6 days for over half a decade. My brain was foggy as I lazily strolled down each step, more memories of the life I left behind flooding my thoughts with every inch I drew closer to my broken shell of a body. After shifting to the side to pass the more vibrantly shaded version of myself, whose head was pressed to the concrete, with his body limp to the steps above and legs almost hovering in the air, I almost laughed at the sight of this bizarre posture. It was like a moment frozen in time, my damaged frame not yet having slumped lifeless. As I glared at this puzzling sight, an oddly amused smirk crossing my lips, I noticed the slightest and slowest hints of movements. No, it wasn't locked in time, but the moments were trickling by, the still, somewhat rosy cheeks, the ever so slightly visible throbbing of the pulse and the outstretched wrists expanding so slowly I had to hold my gaze to notice. Even the wrinkles of my midnight blue jumpsuit shifting as they steadily settled. I was still alive. I couldn't know if this was something I could await or if I had to, leap into my body again, contorting this intangible form into the same position as the one before me, but with the one wishing to guide me to whatever is next for me, still lingering somewhere in this park. I wasn't about to drag my heels on figuring out how to go about this. That was until I reached out my hand, closing the gap between the split pieces of my soul and body, when an alarmingly loud shriek caused me to freeze in my tracks. There was something about the intense pitch of that agonized howl, such a contrast to every other sound I had heard since finding myself here, being so muted and muffled. I don't know what it was, whether the knowledge that were I to fully reconnect with my empty shell, I would just be returning to my equally vacant life, or just that desperate desire to prove that I could be something better than some drunken deadbeat going nowhere. But I had to do something. Before I had time to give it a second thought, I ran in pursuit of the scream as it bellowed, seemingly across every inch of this damned place. There was still life in that terrified howl, something real and tangible, not just another hollow echo of those beyond the reach of the real world above. My movements were erratic and unfocused, singularly guided by my pursuit. I couldn't know if my own Reaper was still out there, set to pull me prematurely from this place, whether my slowly dwindling husk was still capable of housing a wayward soul or not, or whether it was just biding its time until I was ready to meet it officially. I wasn't thinking clearly. I knew that much. These misty and cloaked figures had their mission, but I had my own as well, one that took precedence over what they may have in store for me. If I lost my way back to the world I left behind in this effort to set things right for another, so be it. My life could be damned for all I cared at that moment. I was selfish in life, unmotivated and worthless. Hell, I was barely alive even when I was kicking around in my depleting meat suit, just existing. If this person was still able to reclaim their body as I could be, I had to help them, no matter what it meant for me. I can't say how long it took for me to find her, the brunette woman face to face with another of those haunting figures. It felt like I could have been running for hours or minutes, maybe even seconds. Time felt different in this place, and given my body still attempting to fall limp to the ground, I don't think I was exactly jumping to conclusions on that. She wasn't mesmerized, as those led away by those things had been before, but she couldn't seem to break free either. There was space on either side of her to run, but she appeared paralyzed by her fear as she dropped to the pavement beneath her. "Hey!" I yelled out, uncertain of anything else to do. This grabbed the attention of the woman, but did not so much as faze the one shrouded in fog and smoke. I saw some semblance of hope spark alive in her deep brown eyes, and I could only hope that I would have the ability to fulfill that. As the eerie figure reached down to where she sat, with her back pressed to the wall, her wailing silenced, the closer its bony hand drew. It was like its presence was rendering her desire to get back to the waking world as mute and muffled as just about everything else in this damn place. I had no time to figure out a plan or weigh the pros and cons of any rash decisions. I had to act before those hauntingly slender fingers made contact. Once more, leaving any inner rationality behind, I just charged right at the damn creature, preparing to take the place of the now hypnotized woman, if that's what it took. I screamed out both hopelessly and filled with rage as I made to tackle the dark figure, when I found my body careening to the concrete, having practically burst that thing apart like a damn smoke grenade. I had no idea what had actually happened at first. Still mentally stunned, I rolled back to a sitting position, looking around for any trace of that shadowed form, only seeing the equally perplexed big brown eyes of its would-be victim glaring back at me. I gave a shrug, having no words to offer, while we both got back to our feet, before sharing a bewildered chuckle at the madness of it all. I tried, to the best of my ability, to explain to her where we actually were, or where I assumed it to be anyway. She clearly was still as mentally vacant as I was when I first came back to awareness here, so I chose not to push it too far. I honestly have no idea how I would have reacted to this news had someone else attempted to lift the veil for me. All I could think to do was to assure her that there was something we had to find to set things right, that we had to locate this before it was too late. Yes, I had not the foggiest of ideas where her body may be, nor if it was something I would even be able to see. I could only hope that her marbles would return, should we track it down. She was hesitant to trust me at first, and I couldn't blame her for that. This muted reality was enough to leave anyone anxious and unnerved, even without some stranger suggesting investigating the damn place. But as we began to wander on, I could see her strides growing more confident. Whether that confidence was in our quest or with my company, I couldn't say, but it was something. For a time, we ran aimlessly, having no distinct course to follow. I was avoiding going near the borders of the place, knowing that the sight of the void beyond the gates would send her absent mind reeling again. But with my memories of navigating this park having returned, mostly, I felt confident that we could rule everything out before having to explore the outskirts, if it came to that. Rounding another corner, having seen nothing or no one else for God knows how long, we almost ran right into another small group of people, a sight which caused me to wrap my trembling hand around her mouth before the imminent scream could escape. This was one of the older sections of the park, mostly housing kiddie rides and such. This small group was perched beside the carousel, which was likely twice as old as I was, at least. This ride, though, was discolored in the most bizarre way, a distinct contrast to the muted hues of every other ride. It had something of a crimson aura, which pulsed ever so slightly. It was unsettling for certain, but far from my concern at the time. Just as it was by the roller coaster, the group stood before another of those haunting, wispy figures, but I could see that they were not concerned with us. There were only 4 this time, 2 young women and 2 young men. 1 male and 1 female were wearing park uniforms, while the other 2, likely visitors to the park. Again, each of them wore grotesque wounds, but their faces were contorted in horror. Though their mannerisms and posture appeared far more relaxed as they casually paced toward their escort, none of the quintet before us reacted to our presence, apparently solely concerned with their own circumstances. I couldn't blame them, of course. One was simply doing its job, and the others had little left to worry about anymore, considering the gravity of those wounds inflicted into their flesh. Hesitating for a moment, my mind racing through all of these thoughts as we skidded to a halt, I just wrapped my arm around the woman next to me, trying to keep her calm as we continued to drift past them. My heart was racing harder than it had yet, be it from my newfound awareness that I still had functioning organs, the fear I may be losing my one chance to return to the real world, or the fate of this one other person who trembled violently by my side. I just tried to keep my focus on getting both of us back home, if that would even be a possibility. I had no idea what sort of condition her body may be in, nor the circumstances that led her here. I could only imagine what was going through her head, having clearly not regained any of her memories. But I had to keep my focus on what I could control, even if I had no idea what that was. Some moments after gradually easing past the carousel, I saw that violent aura emitting from behind, illuminating the path ahead. "Don't," I said as the brunette began to turn her head. "Don't look back." With a subtle nod, we continued on our course, quickening our pace again, the further we distanced ourselves from those already dead. As we neared one of the rest areas, surrounded by more browned bushes and trees, where families would often settle down for a picnic or just to relax, my traveling companion began to slow her stride. Slowing down to match her pace, we stopped in place seconds later. She began to glance around, a puzzled yet somewhat peaceful look on her face. I honestly hadn't even noticed how pretty she was until this moment, the way her long, wavy dark hair cascaded over her shoulders.
"Willow,"
she said, a half smile reaching across her lips.
"My name is Willow."
She darted her eyes to the bushes to our left, hesitantly pacing to the parting between them. As we wandered deeper into the deceased trees, I noticed her jaw falling limp as we crossed into a small clearing, her eyes watering ever so slightly. All I saw was the patchy greenery, as she could clearly make out what I could not. "What do you see? Is it..."
"Me. My body. I remember."
"You have to... Okay, I don't know how it works, but you have to..."
"I know. But what if he's still there?"
"He?" She stepped closer to what I assumed had to be the place in which she lay, her head waving from one side to the other. Kneeling down, outstretching her hand, she glanced back at me, her eyes wailing all the more.
He attacked me. Struck me across the head. If he's still there..."
"I'll help you. I'll find a way to reach you."
"How?"
I'm not sure, but you have to go back before it's too late. Time is still moving there. I'll find my way back too, and..." Before I could offer another word, she faded from before me, her essence seemingly carried away by an absent breeze. My heart racing again, so many questions battling for dominance in my mind. I just backed away. Part of me actually wondered if she had died right in front of me, but there was no trace of any of those slender shadows. No, she would have been led away, just like the others, right? Yeah, she had made her way back home. That had to be the case. And she needed help. She needed my help. Clearly, no one else knew she was out there, possibly being violated while I attempted to regulate my thoughts. I couldn't linger any longer. I'd stayed in this damn place to save her, and now I had to find a way to return to finish that job before she could be sent back to this dismal place for the last time. Before, I didn't have much of a reason to return to my pointless existence, but it wasn't about me anymore. Once more I ran. I ran on a far more confident course than I had up until this point. I knew exactly where I had to go and how to get there. I wasted no senseless glances around my surroundings anymore, nor did I step a single foot off of my chosen path. Again, I drifted past wayward souls being guided to the next step in their own journeys, but I didn't so much as acknowledge them now. They didn't pay me any mind, nor did their escort. They were simply more scenery, blending into the background as I made my escape, once and for all. When I finally arrived back to where my empty vessel was attempting to finalize its descent to the concrete, however, I felt that last semblance of hope slipping from my trembling grasp. Not only for myself, but for the one who may very well rejoin me in this place, should I fail in these final steps. It just hovered there, right in front of me, between my now shivering spectral form and the more tangible husk almost flattened to the ground, those smoky tendrils spreading from either side, and its slender, bony arm reaching out to me. My trembling subsided as I gazed upon the inviting warmth of that entrancing gaze. My feet felt as though they weren't even touching the ground as I strolled closer, ready to allow my escort to guide me wherever it may. My own fingers lifted, my mind begging to entwine them with those beckoning to me. My lips whispered, my mind falling behind. I have to...
Come,
I heard echoing into my waiting ears.
Fear not, my friend.
I felt its warmth embracing my fingertips as my hand lingered above its. I wanted nothing more than to... No, my lips uttered. It began to move closer, the gap between us so slim that I could so easily wrap my arms around it, but... No! I practically leapt back, almost stumbling back to the concrete. My mind rejoined my head like a drunk driver to an unsuspecting tree. I have to go back. It just tilted its shrouded skull, those orange eyes still attempting to weave through my senses. I glanced at my body, still not fully conjoined with the ground beneath it, its feet only inches from falling limp. Please, it's not over yet. I aggressively thrust my pointer finger forward, gesturing to my remains almost slumped across the steps. It drifted its head around, its slender body shifting with its gaze. While it appeared to be studying my potentially borderline lifeless vessel, I would not await its decision. I just leapt from the ground, throwing myself at my vacated flesh and bone, pleading with every fragment of whatever I was at the time to be granted entry to my mortal shell. As a shrieking howl echoed from the shrouded mouth, whipping its head around to gaze upon my near hopeless attempt to reclaim my life, the world blinked out from before my eyes. Darkness replaced the muted and dismal hues of the world around me, assuring me that my final effort had been in vain. Somewhere in the black, I grew aware of something else. Something which had been absent since I opened my eyes to that empty reality. Something that fucking hurt. The muffled moan reverberated across the concrete before I began blinking my eyes back to awareness. I was dazed and completely unfocused, my head still loopy from the alcohol, as I attempted to shift my body from its uncomfortable posture. As the realization of my circumstances kicked in, the staggered memories still attempting to reform, only one fact stuck in the forefront of my mind. Before even lifting myself from the steps, or inspecting how injured my tumble had left me, I reached to my hip, slipping the radio from my belt. While it would seem that security had their hands full with some other goings-on at the park, one of the apparent officers who had been called in assured me they would head to the picnic area to check things out. Dragging myself the rest of the way off the steps, rolling onto my back and cursing the now aching nerve endings to which I had only recently reunited, I lifted myself into a sitting position. My uniform was torn in several places, with blood oozing through the splits, but things didn't look as bad as they could have been. I patted my fingers gently against where my head pulsed on the back, finding the blood still trickling from the meaty wound, but the skull was still intact from what I could tell. My left cheek was scuffed up from the concrete, also oozing fluids, but not nearly as dramatically as my scalp, which would likely require stitches. As I got to my feet, my legs trembling from the shock of everything, and the decent amount of blood loss, given the puddle from which I peeled myself, I was still thrilled to relocate an upright position. While I hobbled back up the steps, gripping the railing tightly in an effort not to stumble back down, a voice came over the radio. It would seem that Willow did not require my help as much as I feared. The man who had attacked her, leaving her unconscious on the ground, apparently had quite the rude awakening himself once she came to. As he was apparently working on unbuckling her pants, he didn't notice her reaching for a twig lying on the ground just a ways from where she lay. Well, she didn't push it deeply enough to send him packing to the other park. The eye she impaled will potentially be awaiting him when he ends up on the other side someday. Tucker Sloan, the guy who struck her across the back of the head, dragging her out of sight, intent on both having his way with her and leaving her for dead, had quite the checkered past. From details I would find out over the following week, there was already a handful of restraining orders against the man, as well as some warrants in neighboring states. Willow, with whom I have talked a great deal with since we arrived at the hospital, being treated for alarmingly similar head wounds, had arrived at the park with some friends some hours prior to the incident. After her group dissolved for the night, each heading back to their respective homes, the lovely brunette decided to just wander the grounds for a bit, not yet ready to head back to her otherwise empty apartment. She had also been through a messy breakup some weeks back, and wasn't quite up to facing that crippling solitude. I'm not one to believe in fate, for the most part, but we had both been dumped, sent to somewhere deep below the boundaries of the park after suffering cracked domes, and found that we had a great deal in common over many long conversations. Yeah, we're taking things slow, as neither of us are quite ready to commit to anything more than casual right now, but things seem to be looking up in a life I almost abandoned not so long ago. I've given up the bottle, at least until I may learn to treat it as more of a casual fancy than a coping mechanism. I've also started taking some night classes to earn some sort of skill set beyond cleaning up after others. I plan on quitting my job at Arcadian Heights soon too, once it opens back up for business anyway. It was forced to close its gates for the time being, ever since that Nights of Fear event left many unfortunate souls being guided away from the underbelly. The investigation is still ongoing, but the employees are still getting paid for this unexpected time off, so I can't complain. I don't know the half of what happened over that October, but given some of the bizarre rumors I've heard, my bizarre night was nothing compared to what some other folks endured. Now, whatever the case, whatever is true or just exaggerated small talk, even if they end up shutting down the park for good once all is said and done, I think it's time to prove to myself that I deserve something better than some dead-end job. I may be just beginning my journey in what I hope to be the right direction, but I actually want to see what tomorrow has in store for me now. Who could have predicted that all I needed was to prematurely kick the bucket to gain some clarity on how beautiful life can truly be?